introduction. I have one problem. As you probably know, we last year had...
Recording in progress.
Last year we had a little meeting of some of us per Zoom, and I presented an early version of this paper. And Pier Paolo suggested, since he already knows the early version, that I should focus on the other part, what I added new, so that the people who took part in this Zoom meeting don't have to be bored too much. The fact is that what I presented last year was the four main theories of the family that I see in the history of philosophy: Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel. But I will, for this reason, only very quickly hover over them and focus on the transitions and their aftermath. So the Platonic, why is Plato so important in the concept of the family? Because he is the first critic of the institution of the family. He thinks that a lot of ills are connected to the family, and clearly this is based on the Greek experience that a common sense for the political realm was prevented by the feeling that you belong to a group of people related to each other. And therefore, there is the ideal that at least the guardians should live in a community of goods and wives. At the same time, Plato is, in a very, very broad sense of the term, a proto-feminist insofar as he insists on the same education for men and women. And in his last work, The Laws, Plato introduces, recognizes the necessity of families, but even here he insists on a far-reaching political equality of women. Women are entitled to political offices and subject to military service, even if the age limits are different. Women should neither be treated as slaves, as among the Thracians and other barbarians, nor restricted to the home, as in Athens, but be able to defend their country. Interesting is also that for violations of sexual norms, Plato foresees the same punishments for man and woman, an impressive deviation from the double standard that was valid even in several legal systems of Western Europe until after World War II. I mentioned in a footnote Article 559 of Italian Codice Penale, which was declared unconstitutional only in 68 and 69. It limited the legal concept of adultery to the woman. The husband could only be punished if he held a concubine in the house of his spouses or notoriously somewhere else. And Plato has already the idea that the punishment must be the same. Still, the similar position concerning public law is not matched at all by the rules of civil law. Women cannot inherit or own property, according to Plato, and are under the tutelage of a male relative. Even when a father has only daughters, he has to bequeath his property to the son-in-law. Normally, it is the male relatives who choose a woman's husband. Only unmarried women are permitted to bring civil action. Aristotle's criticism of Plato is well known, and clearly Aristotle has brought forth some very classical arguments why the family remains an indispensable institution, and why instead of achieving a general altruism by abolishing family, we would only have a general indifference and not at all a greater altruism among people. And he has also a model of the three basic social institutions: the oikos, the household, the kome, the village, and the polis. At the same time, he gives up the relative symmetry between man and woman that we have in Plato. It is true that the relation between the spouses is the least asymmetrical within the household. The relation between parents and children and the relation between master and slaves are more asymmetric, but still even the relation of the husband and the woman is called monarchical. And he insists very much on the superiority of the man over the woman. So this is a very, very short abridgment of the two sections on Plato and Aristotle. The most important event in the evolution of the Western doctrines of marriage is the rise of Christianity. On the one hand, unlike early Christianity, unlike the pagan religions, early Christianity, inspired by evangelical councils, subordinated the married life to the celibate. The defense of marriage as an equally legitimate form of life became increasingly a minority position. Think of Jerome's ferocious attacks against such a position, upheld by Jovinian in Adversus Jovinianum. On the other hand, the church never condemned marriage, as Montanus and later Priscillianus, who at the same time defended an equality of the sexes, did. On the contrary, she bestowed a particular dignity on marriage, beginning with Paul's comparison of husband and wife with Christ and the church in the epistle to the Ephesians, a comparison which still excluded symmetry between the spouses, since Christ and the church cannot be considered equal partners. Based on this Pauline passage, Augustine ascribes sacramental character to marriage and justifies thereby its indissolubility. Marriage remained among the sacraments when they were limited to 7 in the sentences by Peter Lombard, and this was confirmed by the Fourth Council of the Lateran in 1213. The Christian restriction of legitimate sexuality to marriage slowly contributed to evolution in sexual mores, which would be reversed on a general theoretical level only in the course of the 20th century. The new ideas were revolutionary, particularly if compared with the form of life that the upper classes of Rome, including the women, had begun to adopt in the 1st century BC. Suffice it to mention of it. But even in relation to antiquity as a whole, some norms of Christian sexual ethics were quite innovative. The consensus among the synoptics makes it obvious that the prohibitions on divorce, which is permitted in Judaism and had become frequent in the Roman Empire, goes back to Jesus himself. It is reiterated by Paul, who appeals explicitly to the Lord and distinguishes from his teachings his own additions. In the vice list of the Didache, fornication, adultery, pederasty, abortion, and infanticide, the latter quite widespread in the pagan world, are mentioned among the things belonging to the way of death. The first 3 are also found in Paul. Religious texts express and shape moral sensibilities, but rarely argue. The later patristic scholastic tradition, however, tried to give rational arguments for the specific Christian understanding of the indissolubility of marriage. Aquinas is important because he not only mirrors the canon law of his time, but also combines a defense of the sacramental nature of marriage with an appreciation of the institution as natural that owes much to Aristotle. The 2 main natural ends of marriage are the reproduction of a species and the reciprocal help of the spouses. Aquinas explains the lifelong nature of a commitment with the length of the time needed for the raising of a child, with what today would call the altriciality of humans. He even gives some examples from the animal world. Mating is sufficient as interaction between the parents when the newborn animal can feed itself or can be fed by the mother alone. But when a cooperation of both parents is needed, we see, as in some species of birds, a cooperation of both parents. The diverse forms that marriage finds in different cultures do not change the fact that it is an institution rooted in nature, since natural law can be differentiated according to external circumstances. Marriage was instituted before the fall by God, but Moses added the prohibition of incest, a prohibition that was earlier cleverly justified by Augustine with the argument that the obligation to marry outside of the family increases the number of bonds of friendships that connect people. And it's interesting that it has been recently argued by Joseph Henry, professor in Harvard, who is an alumnus of Notre Dame, in his book, The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous, that one, not the only, but one of the reasons for the peculiar success of Western cultures was the Catholic Church's strict taboo on marriages between even quite distant relatives, for it prevented the formation of family clans, which have rendered the formation of a meritocratic society and polity so difficult, for example, in the Arab world. And the idea that this is an advantage of exogenous families goes back to Augustine's De Civitate Dei, 1516. The third institution of marriage, according to Aquinas, occurred within the New Covenant with the sacramental interpretation of marriage as pointing to the commitment of Christ and the Church. Finally, there is also an institution by civil law motivated by the mutual services of the spouses. Marriage is thus a natural, civil, and sacramental institution, according to Aquinas. The efficient cause of marriage is the consent of the spouses, and thus a form of contract, which has to be expressed verbally, even if words without accompanying consent are not sufficient to constitute marriage. Aquinas anticipates John Langshaw's Austin's theory of speech acts when he states that the words of the spouses during the wedding ceremony both signify and affect marriage. A public ceremony is not necessary for the validity of marriage, even if it is usually sinful to marry in secret. Forced consent invalidates a marriage. Even parents cannot force their children to consent to marriage. On the other hand, slaves do not need their master's consent to undergo a valid marriage. Even positive law cannot change this, since positive law cannot break natural law. The sacramental dimension of marriage sanctifies the institution by granting it indissolubility and is, as already in Augustine, the highest of the three goods of marriage, descendants and mutual faithfulness being the two other ones. The divorce of the spouses in the case of adultery is permitted, though not mandated, since faithfulness has been violated, yet this does not entail a right to remarry. The term divorcium in Aquinas corresponds to what we call today separation. Aquinas' evaluation of adultery from the side of the husband and the wife respectively is interesting. From the point of faithfulness, both forms of adultery are equally sinful, but from the point of view of the descendants, the woman sins more. Aquinas seems to have in mind that only the adulterous wife obliges her husband to raise children not his own, an argument indeed often used in the tradition to justify the double standard. But it is still remarkable that Aquinas insists on equal treatment concerning the relation of faithfulness. From a sociological point of view, there is little doubt that for many centuries, the belief in the sacramental nature of marriage strengthened the sense of commitment of the spouses. A failed marriage would symbolize the loss of Christ's unity with the Church and thus of one's own salvation. What led to the decline of a Catholic conception of marriage and the rise of a new one? The most decisive force was certainly the rise of liberalism as a political philosophy, focusing on the rights of individuals who engage with each other according to their needs and desires in the forms of contract. But without Protestantism, the liberal revolution would have hardly occurred. Luther denied the sacramental status of marriage, which for him is a social estate, and Calvinism followed suit, even if the late Calvin offered a covenant theology of marriage. An important consequence of this desacramentalization is drawn by John Milton in his famous 4 tracts defending divorce, which challenged the Anglican Church, which continued to follow canon law. Milton's central claim in the first edition of the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce is that indisposition, unfitness, or contrariety of mind arising from a cause in nature unchangeable, hindering and ever likely to hinder the main benefits of conjugal society, which are solace and peace, is a greater reason of divorce than natural frigidity, especially if there be no children and that there be mutual consent. His argument is based on the principle of Christian charity, which should not condemn people to unhappiness. He furthermore uses the argument that even more than sexual impotence, which Aquinas recognizes as a legitimate reason for declaring a marriage invalid, as long as it pre-existed matrimony and the wife had not been informed, incompatibility of characters justifies the dissolution of marriage and should not prevent a second marriage. Otherwise, sexual intercourse is considered more essential to marriage than the community of minds, while in fact the main purpose of marriage is not intercourse, but a happy conversation that overcomes loneliness. Milton goes even so far as to downplay the responsibility for the children from a loveless marriage, since they are, as he says, children of wrath and almost like bastards. He rejects the natural objection that the compatibility of characters should be studied before marrying by saying, probably correctly in his time, that before marriage, the betrothed could not freely spend time together, and therefore the more serious and timid characters are more likely to err than womanizers. As you all know, Milton was married 3 times. However, he did not get his marriages annulled. He was lucky enough that his first 2 wives, who was very unhappily married, died of natural cause. Milton is rightly regarded as a proto-liberal. His ideas concerning the separation of state and church, the freedom of the press, the right to resistance against the government are no less innovative than his defense of divorce. It does therefore not come as a surprise that the father of modern liberalism, John Locke, expands the Miltonian idea. The family is important in the 2 treatises of government because the first, directed against Robert Filmer's Patriarcha of the Natural Power of Kings, which was published posthumously in 1680, completely rejects any attempt to conceive of political power according to the model of a patriarchally ruled family. But the second treatise tries to show that Filmer's concept of family is wrong, even if you abstract from its purported political relevance. The power of the husband is not that of an absolute monarch, even if the last determination in cases of conflict naturally falls to the man's share as the abler and the stronger. Yet the wife retains the right to separate from him and sometimes even to take the children with her. This may depend on the customs or laws of the country or on a contract made between the spouses, for Locke explicitly recognizes the possibility of marriage contracts as flexible as any other voluntary compact. They need not be always for life. While the long phase of dependence of children necessitates that human marriage be more lasting than the bonds of other creatures, Locke suggests to inquire, quote, why this compact where procreation and education are secured and inheritance taken care of may not be made determinable either by consent or at a certain time or upon certain conditions, as well as any other voluntary compact, there being no necessity in the nature of the thing, nor to the ends of it, that it should always be for life. Locke goes further than Milton toward contractualism. What is missing in him, however, is the proto-romantic element that is so powerful in the poet of the love of Adam and Eve in Paradise Lost. The bachelor Locke has no sensibility for the specific erotic dimension of marriage, the desire to find a kindred soul, which for Milton antecedes the sexual need and the wish to reproduce. This desire is probably not an anthropological constant, but developed slowly in the Western tradition. The discovery of an autonomous erotic realm in the Roman poetry of the 1st century BC and the new evaluation of woman's role brought forth by Christianity led in the 12th century, initially in France, to a new romantic ideal of the love between man and woman. This ideal both inspired and endangered the traditional institution of marriage, for it led to expectations that are rarely fulfilled. But the new ideal of courtly love was limited to the elites. Only in the 18th century did it spread to the bourgeoisie. Rousseau's Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse forcefully expresses the idea that marriage should be based on love, not on economic or class considerations. Despite their deviation from traditional Christianity in the questions of divorce, Locke and obviously Milton are sincere Christians. It is worth noting that the strongest defense of the indissolubility of marriage in the British Enlightenment stems from an author who is certainly not a Christian. I refer to David Hume and his essay of Polygamy and Divorces of 1742. On the one hand, Hume is much better informed of the varieties of reproductive arrangements that humankind has brought forth in its history than the authors whom I've mentioned up to now. Hume also considers ecological factors in order to explain the different behavior of various animal species. He writes in a time in which both historical and geographical knowledge had increased prodigiously, and sociology began to rise as a discipline no longer dependent on ethics and normative political philosophy. In 1744, Giambattista Vico published the last edition of his Scienza Nuova, in which he develops the foundations of a general theory of human culture. In the 4th chapter of the 2nd book on poetic economy, he gives an extremely realistic account of the brutality of archaic family life. 4 years later, Montesquieu's De l'Esprit des Lois follows suit, whose 23rd book deals with family law and demography in a comparative spirit. But all this is ethnographic and historic erudition does not change Hume's commitment to lifelong monogamy. He intelligently states the arguments both for polygamy and divorce, but staunchly rejects them. Polygyny destroys the equality between the sexes and renders both romantic love and friendship impossible. Barbarism, therefore, appears to be the inseparable attendant of polygamy. With regard to divorce, it seems cruel to deny to hearts not made for each other another chance. The insecurity of marriage, furthermore, forces the partners to exert themselves to keep the institution alive. Hume does not contest the partial validity of these two arguments, but thinks that they are trumped by the following considerations. First, the fate of the children upon the separation of the parents. Second, the stabilization by institutional constraints of friendship, which should be the basis of marriage, not volatile erotic attraction. Third, the natural connection of an unlimited temporal horizon with a union as total as that of marriage. I skip also on the two chapters on Kant and Hegel. Kant, on the one hand, continues the radical contractualist view, but with a strong commitment to the indissolubility of marriage. Hegel, who rejects contractualism, is open for divorce in extreme cases. And the Hegelian conception is strongly influenced by the Aristotelian, but unfortunately, there is no time. I have only less than 3 minutes left to deal with these two complex theories that I presented last year. I want to look at the developments later. Even the increasing insistence on symmetry between spouses in the new contractualist model did not yet lead to equal rights for women in the economic and political sphere. It is Fichte's merit to have realized, as one of the first thinkers, that this inequality needed a justification, particularly since he shares Kant's commitment to universalist ethics based on equal freedom and sees in action the essence of self-consciousness. That women must have all the human and civil rights of men can only be gainsaid if they are denied their humanity. This is a principle that Fichte explicitly endorses, and he obviously does not reject the humanity of women. Nevertheless, he claims that they cannot want to exert their rights. When unmarried, they are like young men under the authority of their fathers, and when married, they have the dignity in being subjected to their husbands. Why? Fichte's argument is based on the fact that women's sexuality is passive and not active like the male one. This is incompatible with the active nature of self-consciousness, and a woman can only tolerate this humiliating contrast if she lives her sexuality in form of a complete dedication to her husband. While a man can proudly satisfy his sexuality, a woman must be ashamed of it if she does not accept her husband with complete love. And this means that she cannot, for example, have any political rights, but only try to influence her husband. I will not comment on these claims and ignore Fichte's horrific denial of children having any rights by natural law, even the right to sustenance with regard to their parents. Fichte explicitly says parents have the right to expose their children, like in old Roman law, in the late 18th century. What is progressive is something else. Based on his principle of the equal rights of the sexes and his theory that the married woman cannot want to claim them, Fichte recognizes that one must not deprive single women, whether unmarried, widowed, or divorced, of the economic and political rights that men have. However, since they cannot renounce the desire to marry again in the future, they cannot become public officials, for the future possible submission to their husbands would disqualify them from public duties. And since higher education should prepare for public work, women should not be allowed to access it. One sees that Fichte's solution is very far from our modern sensibilities, but he has the merit to have raised already in the 18th century the question more clearly than almost all of his male contemporaries. The fight for the same economic and political rights for women is certainly one of the most important struggles of the 19th century. It was completed only in the 20th century in some, by far not all, countries of the world. It deeply impacted the nature of family, for in the moment in which the woman became economically independent, divorce became more feasible, and the state had less interest in preventing it. Greater equality, even if not strictly incompatible with, furthermore corroded the doctrine of the complementarity of the sexes. Perhaps the two most original works that pressed for legal equality are Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Rights of Women of 1792 and John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women in 1869. Wollston's monograph, dedicated to the former Bishop Charles Maurice Cailleran, is a foundational work in the history of feminism for at least two reasons. First, it is a woman herself who addresses the question. Before her, the matter was usually left to the deliberations of men. Second, Wollstonecraft's touching demand for female rights is inspired by a deep and sincere religiosity and a strong sense of both justice and the moral duties of women. While raised as an Anglican, her religion in this phase of life is close to that of the Unitarian rational dissenters, also due to her friendship with Richard Price. Her rationalist, anti-voluntarist understanding of God, the rejection of a literal interpretation of the Bible, her claim that ethics is grounded in reason and not in sentiments, her belief in historical progress are surprisingly similar to Kant, even if she did not know him and was ignored by him too. Wollstonecraft upholds as a central idea the moral and legal equality of both sexes. Again and again, she claims strenuously that there is only one standard of virtue, as there is one God, and that one must not give a sex to morals. And her ultimate aim is to enable women to come as close as possible to the virtues traditionally associated with men and to gain respect, even if she knows that society does not love masculine women. She detests features often connected with women, such as cunning, coquettishness, and the inability to control one's passion. I have to finish here, unfortunately. I only mention that the importance of John Stuart Mill it was engaged in the legal reforms that in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, then led to greater legal and political equality for men and women. And this seemed to me the main steps in the history of the family. Thank you for your attention.